It was the morning of October 3rd, 1984, when 9-year-old Christine Jessop stepped off her school bus near her home in Queensville, Ontario. The fall air was cool, the sky pale and gray, and the small rural neighborhood felt quiet. The kind of quiet where neighbors knew each other's routines and children walked home without worry. Christine was carrying her school things, likely thinking about homework or dinner, or something small and ordinary the way kids do. By the time her mother returned home shortly after 4 p.m., Christine was gone. Her jacket was hung on a high hook, higher than she could have reached herself. Something was dreadfully wrong. Somewhere between the bus stop and her front door, Christine disappeared. When her mother, Janet Jessop, realized Christine wasn't home, panic set in quickly. At first, she assumed her daughter had gone to a friend's house, something children in Queensville often did without much notice. But as time passed, concern turned into dread. Janet called friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen Christine after school. No one had. By early evening, police were notified, and what started as a local search rapidly turned into one of the largest missing child investigations in Canadian history. Police canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Christine get off the bus, seen a suspicious vehicle, heard anything unusual. Classmates were questioned. Bus drivers were interviewed. Fields, ditches, barns, wooded areas, everything surrounding Queensville was searched by officers, volunteers, and search and rescue teams. Helicopters circled overhead. Dogs were brought in to track Christine's scent, but there were no solid leads. Christine had vanished without witnesses, without screams, without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle at the bus stop or near her home. It was as if she had been swallowed by the landscape. As the days passed, hope began to fade, but no one wanted to speak it aloud. Then, 3 months later, on December 31st, 1984, New Year's Eve, a group of people walking near a wooded area in Sunderland, Ontario, about 50 kilometers north of Queensville, made a horrifying discovery. A child's remains were found in the snow-covered brush. Dental records soon confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to Christine Jessop. The news devastated her family and shattered the community. What had begun as a missing child case had now become a murder investigation. Police knew they were searching not just for someone who had taken Christine, but someone who had killed her. The autopsy revealed that Christine had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her body had been left in the woods and exposed to the elements. The brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned investigators. The idea that someone could abduct a child from a quiet rural street in broad daylight and then murder her sent fear rippling through Ontario. Parents walked their children to school. Doors were locked during the day. Communities that once trusted their neighbors now watched each other with suspicion. In early 1985, pressure increased to find someone responsible. Police began to focus on a neighbor, 25-year-old G. Paul Morin, whose home sat next door to the Jessops. He was described as different by some in the community and became the target of intense scrutiny. He was quiet, introverted, and socially awkward, traits that would soon be interpreted not as personality quirks, but as red flags. Police learned that Morin had been home around the time Christine disappeared. He had no airtight alibi. And when investigators began questioning him, they believed his answers were strange, inconsistent, and overly detailed. From the very beginning, Morin insisted he had nothing to do with Christine's disappearance or death. He told police he had been at home that afternoon, listening to music, working on hobbies, and resting. But officers viewed his calm demeanor as suspicious. They felt he wasn't reacting the way an innocent man should react. In hindsight, this moment would become one of the most tragic turning points in Canadian legal history. Police began to fixate on Morin, narrowing their focus almost exclusively on him. Instead of continuing to pursue multiple suspects, their investigation became centered on proving Moran's guilt, not discovering the truth. In January 1985, just weeks after Christine's body was found, Moran was arrested and charged with her murder. The community was stunned. Moran, meanwhile, maintained his innocence and seemed genuinely confused by the accusations against him. But police believed they had their man. There was no eyewitness testimony, no confession, no physical evidence linking him directly to the crime scene, but prosecutors moved forward anyway. In 1986, Moran stood trial for Christine's murder. The courtroom became a theater of fear, emotion, and speculation. Prosecutors painted Moran as a quiet predator hiding behind a harmless exterior. They presented fibers, hairs, and bloodstains that they claimed linked him to Christine's death. Expert witnesses testified about behavioral patterns, about how offenders often live close to their victims, about how sexual murderers can appear normal to those around them. But much of the evidence was shaky, based on forensic methods that were later proven unreliable, particularly hair comparison analysis, which juries at the time were told was nearly as precise as fingerprints. Moran's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and flawed, and that investigators had prematurely locked onto him while ignoring other possibilities. But the jury wasn't convinced. Moran was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The verdict devastated his family. Moran collapsed in court sobbing. The community felt relief. They thought justice had been served. But behind bars, Moran continued to insist he was innocent. Years passed. But then, in 1995, thanks to advancements in DNA testing, evidence from Christine's clothing was tested against Moran and did not match. It matched an unknown male. Moran was exonerated and released. The revelation sent shockwaves through Canada's justice system. But freedom did not erase what had been done to him. Moran had spent nearly 10 years of his life in prison for a crime he did not commit. He had endured isolation, fear, stigma, and the knowledge that the real killer of Christine Jessop was still out there. And Christine's family, once again, were forced to confront devastating truth. Not only had their daughter been murdered, but the wrong man had been blamed, while the real killer remained unknown. Public outrage erupted. How could police and prosecutors have gotten it so wrong? How could tunnel vision, confirmation bias, and flawed assumptions lead to the destruction of an innocent man's life, while simultaneously failing the victim and her family? In response, the Ontario government launched a full public inquiry into the case. The Kaufman Commission, named after Justice Fred Kaufman, was tasked with examining how Moran had been wrongfully convicted and what systemic failures had allowed it to happen. Over months of hearings, disturbing truths emerged. Police had prematurely focused on Moran and ignored other viable suspects. They interpreted neutral or ambiguous behavior as signs of guilt. They failed to disclose critical information to the defense. Forensic experts overstated the certainty of their conclusions. Prosecutors failed to challenge questionable evidence. And juries were presented with testimony that seemed scientific but was deeply flawed. The inquiry concluded that Moran had suffered a profound miscarriage of justice. In 1997, the Ontario government formally apologized to him and awarded him $1.25 million in compensation, one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in Canadian history at the time. But while Moran's name was cleared, Christine Jessop's killer remained unidentified. Years passed. Her case remained open, though leads were scarce. Evidence had degraded over time. Witness memories faded. Some suspects had died. Others had moved away. The community had changed. But investigators continued to revisit the case, hoping that advances in forensic science might someday provide answers. Then, Decades after Christine's murder, something changed. In the late 2000s, a new tool emerged: genetic genealogy. Police submitted DNA from the crime scene to international databases to find familial connections. This was the same breakthrough used to catch other cold case killers. On October 9, 2020, Toronto police announced a match. The DNA belonged to Calvin Hoover, a 28-year-old man at the time of Christine's disappearance who had known the Jessop family. There was one devastating complication. Hoover had died by suicide in 2015. He would never stand trial. He would never be questioned. He would never explain why he abducted Christine, how he lured or forced her into his vehicle, what happened in her final moments, or why he left her body in the woods. For Christine's family, the announcement brought bittersweet closure. After 36 years, they finally knew who had taken their daughter. But there would be no courtroom, no conviction, no sentence. Justice, in its traditional sense, would never come. Still, knowing the truth mattered. It mattered because Christine's name could finally be separated from years of uncertainty and speculation. It mattered because G. Paul Morin's innocence was no longer just a legal conclusion. It was now scientifically undeniable. It mattered because a family that had waited nearly 4 decades could finally grieve with answers instead of questions. Ontario Provincial Police acknowledged the failures of the original investigation and apologized again to Morin and to the Jessop family. They emphasized how modern forensic techniques had succeeded where outdated science and human bias had failed. Christine was 9 years old when she was taken. 9 years old when her life ended in a cold, wooded area far from home. Her childhood was cut short by someone she likely didn't know, someone who vanished back into the world unnoticed, while another man paid the price. Today, Christine is remembered not just as a victim, but as the center of one of Canada's most important criminal justice cases. Somewhere between that school bus stop and her front door, a little girl's life was stolen, and the ripple effects of that moment would echo for nearly 40 years. For Christine Jessop, justice came late, but truth, at least, finally came.